Hello everyone! Welcome to this video where I'll be showing you how to build a RESTful API using Flask and a Python package called Flask-RESTful. I've built REST APIs on this channel before, but this is my go-to package when it comes to building REST APIs using Python and Flask. This package helps keep your project really organized and does many things out of the box. So without any further ado, let's begin with this project. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a Python package called API. And this is to keep things organized. Okay. So I'm going to create another package that is nested under this one called resources, and you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to initialize our poetry package. Okay, so we're going to go to our terminal and we're going to say poetry init. Like I said in my previous videos, poetry is a Python package manager as well as a virtual environment manager for Python. So I'm going to run this in poetry shell. Excellent. And now we're going to install our dependencies. Okay, so here we've got our dependencies as well. Excellent. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create our first resource using Flask-RESTful. So let me show you how we're going to do this. So we're going to create a Python file called user. And this is because we're going to build a user's API. So we're going to create this file. And within this file, we need to create classes. And the classes will basically be for our API. And this is to keep things organized. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. So we're going to create a class and we're going to call it UserList. And this class has to extend the resource class from Flask-RESTful. So let's import that. One second. So here we go. So we've imported resource from Flask-RESTful. Okay. So the way this package works is it responds to HTTP verbs. So the convention is we name our API. So our API will be for users. So we're going to call it user and list. So list is for the get method and the post method. So get is for fetching all of our users and post is for creating our user. And this is because we don't need to pass any user ID. So for fetching all of our users, we're going to create the get method. Okay, and here we're just going to return our users. So here we're going to say results, and here we're going to say users. For now, users is nothing, so let's just go and create that. So I'm going to collapse this, and within our main project, we're going to create a file called users. And we're going to try and essentially simulate that we've got users coming from a database. We're not going to connect to any database in this video, just for simplicity's sake, so we can focus on building the API. And in a later video, I'm going to show you exactly how to connect to a database using an ORM called SQL Alchemy. And yeah, we can essentially start building a production-ready application. But for now, let's just grab our list of users. I've got them saved here, and we're going to add them in this file we created that we called users. So I'm going to close this file, and then I'm going to import this. So I'm going to import this name, users. Okay. So that should be done for now. But we can continue and create our post method for creating a user. So we're going to say post. And here we're going to grab some data from the request. And Flask has an object called request. So we're going to import this one as well. So we're going to import it from Flask. So here from Flask, import request. And we need to grab the JSON data because we're building a RESTful API. We're going to grab the last user ID. And this basically will come from our list that we had. So users, and by accessing -1, we are essentially accessing the last user. And this is because we have them in order. If you were getting this from a database, you wouldn't need to do this. The database would increment automatically when you add a user to the database. So here we're going to grab the ID and we're going to create a new user. So a new user is equal to a dictionary. Our ID will be last user ID +1 because we're incrementing, and we're also going to unpack the data from the request. Again, like I said in my previous video, we're not validating any data for now, but we will do that in a future video. So here we're going to say users.append new user to add our new user we created. We're going to return a dictionary, and I like to add a message in some of my methods, and I'm going to say user created. And here I'm going to say that my user is my new user because we want to always return the new user we created. For now, this will suffice. And what we're going to do is we are going to go here within our API package. And what we're going to do is we're going to define our routes. So the way we do that is we create a file. We're going to call it views. And that is the convention in Flask and also maybe another package or framework that you might know, Django. This is how it's done. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a blueprint. This is from Flask, so we're going to say blueprint. So we're going to import this from Flask, and this takes a couple of arguments. So the first one is the name, so we're going to call this API. The second one is the import name, and we're going to use our file name. And another one that we need is the URL prefix, because we want to prefix all of our routes with something. And this something in this case will be API, because we don't want to specify that in every single one. It's good to specify it here. And we're going to create an API object using the API class from Flask-RESTful. So we import API from Flask-RESTful, and this takes a couple of arguments. So it either takes a Flask application or a blueprint. In this case, we're going to add the blueprint that we created here. So blueprint, and we're going to pass another keyword argument, and that keyword argument is errors. And this is for error handling, and we're going to basically pass the error handling from the blueprint. So we're going to say blueprint.errorhandler. So once this is done, what we're going to do is we're going to say API, and we're going to say add resource, and this is where the magic of Flask-RESTful comes into play. So here we add a resource that we created, and the one we created was UserList. So we're going to import that. Yes, and then as a second argument, we're going to pass the path that we need this API to live under. So we're going to say users. So this essentially our API would because we've extended the blueprint, it will be /API/users. Okay, so we have one more thing to do before our API starts functioning. So we're going to collapse the API, and we're going to go here and we're going to create another file called app. And this is where we're going to run our development server as well as create our Flask application. So we're going to say app is equal to Flask. So we're going to import Flask from Flask, and the first argument that we need is the name. So we're going to add that. And here is where we need to register the blueprint that we created earlier. So we're going to say app.register blueprint, and our blueprint is the blueprint that we created in the other file. So we're going to import that from our views. So once this is done, we're going to run our development server. And like I always like to do, I like to safeguard this file from only running when you run it directly and not when you import it. So we're going to say if name is equal to _main_, then you should run our development server. So we're going to say app.run, and we're going to say our host is 0.0.0.0, and then our port, I'm going to use 8000, and then I'm going to say debug to true, so we can restart our development server once it picks up any changes. So I'm going to go back to my terminal, and I'm going to say Python 3, and then I'm going to run this application. So this is running, and I'm going to navigate to Postman to see if our API works. So I'm here in Postman, and we are at localhost 8000 /API/users, and let's see if this works. And it does. Here we get a dictionary with a key of results, and then we get all of our users. The get fetching a single user will not work because we have not implemented this yet, so it doesn't work. But creating a user should work. So let's just try that one. So I'm going to add a user named James Corden. Let's just make sure that this doesn't exist. They don't exist. So if we go to post and we hit this endpoint, we're prompted that this was created, and here's the user object. So if we go back to fetching all of our users and we hit the endpoint, here we have our user. So this works great. So what we need to do now is we need to go back. Okay, we don't need this. And we're going to go to our file that we called user. And this is within, let's just go here. This is within API, resources, and user. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create the rest of the HTTP verbs for this API. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say class UserResource. So this is the convention when using fetching a specific user. So get, put, and delete. So what we're going to say here is extend resource, and we need to fetch a specific user. So I'm going to say define get, and here we need the user ID. So we're going to say user ID, and we're going to fetch the user that we're trying to get from our API. So I'm going to say user is equal to, I want to filter, and I want to pass a lambda, and I'm going to check if my user's ID matches the ID that was passed to this API call. And here the second argument is our users list, and this gives us a filter object, and what we need to do this is we need to call the next function on it to get the first item within that filter. And if none of them exist, what we're going to do is we're going to default this to none. So this second argument is so we don't throw an exception. And what we're going to do here is we're going to check if our user is none. So if they're none, it means that we have not found a user. So we need to abort. I'm going to import this. You can either import this from Flask-RESTful or Flask. I'm going to do this from Flask-RESTful since we're using Flask-RESTful here. And I'm going to say 404. So essentially return a 404 response, meaning we have not found the user if we have not found them. Otherwise, we're going to return our user. Okay. So this is getting the user. Now we need to create another one for updating the user. So in this case, I'm gonna say put, I'm say user ID, and then we need to get some data from the request. So I'm gonna say data is equal to request, and then we need to get the JSON data from the request object. And here we're gonna say user is equal to none. Why? Because we might not find the user, so we need to let whoever's making that call know that we have not found the user, rather than just telling them we have updated them. So here I'm going to say for I, U in enumerate users, and here I'm going to say if the user, if their ID is equal to the user ID, then we need to update that user. So I'm going to say users of I, because we need to find them by their index, create a new dictionary at the existing user. So I'm unpacking the data from the existing user and also unpacking the data from the request. So whatever data was passed from the request will override this data here. Of course, in a real API, production ready API, I mean, you would do some data validation. But don't worry, we'll cover that in a later video. We just want to grab the fundamentals of Flask-RESTful first, and then we're going to build on top of that. So here I'm going to say user is equal to users of I. And why am I doing that? The reason is to know that we have found the user, and also when we're returning the user back to our API, we will have them here. So what I'm going to say here is if user is none, we want to abort. And the reason I always check if the user is none first is, as a good practice, is to check what we're not expecting, or the opposite of the happy path, let's say. And then if that does not fail, then we continue to our happy path. So here I'm going to return, and I'm going to say message, and I'm going to say that the user was updated. And then we also want to update, we want to return the updated user. So I'm going to say user. Okay, so we have implemented our update method, and here we are going to say delete, just to implement our delete method as well. And we're also going to get the user ID. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say user is equal to none, and then we're going to search for that user. So we're going to say for I, U in enumerate users, and we're going to say if user, if their ID is equal to the user ID that was passed, we have found the user. Thus, we're going to say here user is equal to user. We're not going to use them, but it's just to change the value of this variable from none to something else, so we can let them know that we have found the user and we have deleted them. So here I'm going to say users.pop at the index. And like we always do, I'm going to say if user is none, meaning this would happen if we went through the whole iteration and none of the IDs of the users we have in our database matched the user ID that was passed. So if that is none, we're going to let the front end know that we have not found the user by returning a status code of 404. Otherwise, we're going to let them know that we have found the user and we have deleted them. So we're going to say message, and then we're going to say user deleted. Okay? So this is what we need to do. Now we need to go back to our views. I'm going to duplicate this. So essentially we're going to add another resource, and the other resource would be UserResource. So we're going to import that. And here we need to take a parameter, and the parameter will be of type integer, and we've named it user ID. So this is all we need to do. So if we navigate back to Postman, let's see if we can fetch a specific user. So user of ID 1, we can fetch them correctly. Now, let's update one of the users. So we have here, I've added in the body of the request a name of random name and an age of 20 for user 4. Let's go and fetch user 4 first. So user 4 is Jack Edwards, okay, of age 40. So if we update that to a random name and an age of 20, okay, it seems to have updated. Let's go back. Let's refetch this user. And yes, they have updated correctly. So now if we go to delete, let's delete user of ID 1. This user exists, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, they do. So if we hit this endpoint, it says user deleted. If we go back, we try and fetch this user, 404, they're gone. So yeah, this is the way to build a RESTful API using Flask and Flask-RESTful. Flask-RESTful is an excellent package and it can do many more things. And in a later video, I'll show you how to also document your API as well as do data validation and many more things connecting to a database. So if you like what you've seen here, please subscribe to the channel, like the video because it helps really much, and add any comments in the comment section of any comments you might have about this video or any suggestions for future videos you might have. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.